Okie dokie. Trying something different. We're going with. This is the Philosophical Discourse of Modernity by Jürgen Habermas. Lecture 12. The Normative Content of Modernity. Section 1. The radical critique of reason exacts a high price for taking leave of modernity. In the first place, these discourses can and want to give no account of their own position. Negative dialectics, genealogy, and deconstruction alike avoid those categories in accord with which modern knowledge has been differentiated, by no means accidentally, and on the basis of which we today understand texts. They cannot be unequivocally classified with either philosophy or science, with moral and legal theory, or with literature and art. At the same time, they resist any return to forms of religious thought, whether dogmatic or heretical. So, an incongruity arises between these theories, which raise validity claims only to renounce them, and the kind of institutionalization they undergo within the business of science. There is an asymmetry between the rhetorical gesture with which these discourses demand understanding and the critical treatment to which they are subjected institutionally, for example, in the framework of an academic lecture. No matter whether Adorno paradoxically reclaims truth validity, or Foucault refuses to draw consequences from manifest contradictions, no matter whether Heidegger and Derrida evade the obligation to provide grounds by fleeing into the esoteric or by fusing the logical with the rhetorical, there always emerges a symbiosis of incompatibles, an amalgam that resists normal scientific analysis at its core. Things are only shifted to a different place if we change the frame of reference and no longer treat the same discourse as philosophy or science, but as a piece of literature. That the self-referential critique of reason is located everywhere and nowhere, so to speak, in discourses without a place, renders it almost immune to competing interpretations. Such discourses unsettle the institutionalized standards of fallibilism. They always allow for a final word, even when the argument is already lost. That the opponent has misunderstood the meaning of the language game and has committed a category mistake in the sorts of responses he has been making. The variations of a critique of reason, with reckless disregard for its own foundations, are related to one another in another respect as well. They are guided by normative intuitions that go beyond what they can accommodate in terms of the indirectly affirmed other of reason. Whether modernity is described as a constellation of life that is reified and used, or as one that is technologically manipulated, or as one that is totalitarian, rife with power, homogenized, imprisoned, the denunciations are constantly inspired by a special sensitivity for complex injuries and subtle violations. Inscribed in this sensitivity is a picture of an undamaged intersubjectivity that the young Hegel first projected as an ethical totality, with the counter-concepts injected as empty formulas of being, sovereignty, power, difference, and non-identity. This critique points to the contents of aesthetic experience, but the values derived therefrom and explicitly lay claim to, the values of grace and illumination, ecstatic rapture, bodily integrity, wish fulfillment, and caring intimacy, do not cover the moral change that these authors tacitly envision in connection with a life practice that is intact, and not only in the sense of reconciling inner nature. Between the declared normative foundations and the concealed ones, there is a disparity that can be explained by the undialectical rejection of subjectivity. Not only the devastating consequences of an objectifying relation to self are condemned along with this principle of modernity, but also the other connotations once associated with subjectivity as an unredeemed promise, the prospect of a self-conscious practice in which the solidary self-determination of all was to be joined with the self-realization of each. What is thrown out is precisely what a modernity reassuring itself once meant by the concepts of self-consciousness, self-determination, and self-realization. A further defect of these discourses is explained by their totalizing repudiation of modern forms of life. Although they are interesting in regard to fundamentals, they remain undifferentiated in their results. The criteria according to which Hegel, Marx, and even Max Weber and Lukács distinguish between emancipatory reconciling aspects of social rationalization and repressive alienating aspects have been blunted. In the meantime, critique has taken hold of and demolished the sorts of concepts by which those aspects could be distinguished from one another, so that their paradoxical entanglement became visible. enlightenment and manipulation, the conscious and the unconscious, forces of production and forces of destruction, expressive self-realization and repressive desublimation, effects that ensure freedom and those that remove it, truth and ideology. Now all these moments flow into one another. They are not linked to one another as, say, conflicting elements in a disastrous functional context, unwilling accomplices in a contradictory process permeated by oppositional conflict. Now the differences and oppositions are so undermined and even collapsed that critique can no longer discern contrasts, shadings, and ambivalent tones within the flat and faded landscape of a totally administered, calculated, and power-laden world. To be sure, Adorno's theory of the administered world and Foucault's theory of power are more fertile and simply more informative than Heidegger's or Derrida's lucubrations on technology as an instrumental frame, Gestalt, or on the totalitarian nature of the political order. But they are all insensitive to the highly ambivalent content of cultural and social modernity. This levelling can also be seen in the diachronic comparison of modern forms of life with the pre-modern ones. The high price earlier extracted from the masses of the population in the dimensions of bodily labour, material conditions, possibilities of individual choice, security of law and punishment, political participation and schooling, is barely even noticed. It is worthy of note that in the various approaches to the critique of reason, no systematic place is envisaged for everyday practice. Pragmatism, phenomenology, and hermeneutic philosophy have bestowed an epistemological status upon the categories of everyday action, speech, and common life. Marx even singled out everyday practice as the locus where the rational content of philosophy was supposed to flow into the life forms of an emancipated society. But Nietzsche so directed the gaze of his successors to the phenomena of the extraordinary that they contemptuously glide over the practice of everyday life as something derivative or inauthentic. As we have seen, in communicative action, the creative moment of the linguistic constitution of the world forms one syndrome with the cognitive instrumental, moral practical, and expressive moments of the intramundane linguistic functions of representation, interpersonal relation, and subjective expression. In the modern world, value spheres have been differentiated out from each of these moments, namely, on the one hand, art, literature, and a criticism specialized in questions of taste around the axis of world disclosure, and, on the other hand, problem-solving discourses specialized in questions of truth and justice around the axis of intramundane learning processes. These knowledge systems of art and criticism, science and philosophy, law and morality have become the more split off from ordinary communication, the more strictly and one-sidedly they each have to do with one linguistic function and one aspect of validity. But they should not be considered on account of this abstraction per se as phenomena of decline symptomatic of subject-centered reason. To Nietzscheanism, the differentiation of science and morality appears as a formative process of a reason that at once usurps and stifles the poetic, world-disclosing power of art. Cultural modernity seems a realm of horrors, marked by the totalitarian traits of a subject-centered reason that structurally overburdens itself. Three simple facts are filtered out of this picture. First, the fact that those aesthetic experiences in the light of which true nature is supposed to reveal itself to an exclusive reason are due to the same process of differentiation as science and morality. Then the fact that cultural modernity also owes its division into special discourses for questions of taste, truth, and justice to an increase in knowledge that is hard to dispute. And especially the fact that it is only the modalities of interchange between these knowledge systems and everyday practice that determine whether the gains from such abstraction affect the life world destructively. From the viewpoint of individual cultural spheres of value, the syndrome of the everyday world appears as life, or as practice, or as ethos, over against which stands art, or theory, or morality. We have already spoken about the mediating roles of criticism and philosophy in another context. For criticism, the relationship between art and life is just as problematic as the relationship between theory and practice, or between morality and ethos is for philosophy. The unmediated transposition of specialized knowledge into the private and public spheres of the everyday world can endanger the autonomy and independent logics of the knowledge systems on the one hand, and it can violate the integrity of the life world context on the other. a knowledge specialized in only one validity claim, which, without sticking to its specific context, bounces across the whole spectrum of validity, unsettles the equilibrium of the life world's communicative infrastructure. Insufficiently complex incursions of this sort lead to the aestheticizing, or the scienticizing, or the moralizing of particular domains of life, and give rise to effects for which expressivist countercultures, technocratically carried out reforms, or fundamentalist movements can serve as drastic examples. The profounder paradoxes of societal rationalization, however, are still not even touched by the complicated relationships between ordinary and expert cultures. They have to do with the systematically induced reification of everyday practice, to which I will return presently. However, the first steps along the path to differentiation in the picture of the ambiguously rationalized life world of modern societies already bring to our awareness the problem that will concern us in this last lecture. De-differentiations are built into the leveling critique of reason only on the basis of descriptions that are guided in turn by normative intuitions. This normative content has to be acquired and justified from the rational potential inherent in everyday practice if it is not to remain arbitrary. The concept of a communicative reason that transcends subject-centered reason, which I have provisionally introduced, is intended to lead away from the paradoxes and levelings of a self-referential critique of reason. On another front, it has to be upheld against the competing approach of a systems theory that utterly shoves the problematic of rationality aside, strips away any notion of reason as an old European drag, and then light-footedly takes over from the philosophy of the subject, as well as from the theory of power advanced by its sharpest opponents. This double battlefront makes the rehabilitation of the concept of reason a doubly risky business. It has to protect itself on both flanks from getting caught in the traps of the kind of subject-centered thinking that fail to keep the unforced force of reason free both from the totalitarian characteristics of an instrumental reason that objectifies everything around it, itself included, and from the totalizing characteristics of an inclusive reason that incorporates everything and, as a unity, ultimately triumphs over every distinction. Praxis philosophy hoped to derive the normative content of modernity from the reason embodied in the mediations of social practice. If the basic concept of communicative action replaces that of social labour, is the totality perspective built into that concept radically altered? Section 2. According to Marx, social praxis extends in the dimensions of historical time and social space, within the horizon of a surrounding nature in itself, which also cosmically encompasses the history of the species. It mediates the subjective nature of cooperating individuals with their nature objectivated by our bodily interventions. The mediating process of labour is therefore related to nature under three different aspects: to the experience needs and desires of subjective nature, to the objective nature apprehended and elaborated through objectification, to the nature presupposed by labour as its horizon and foundation. As we have seen in the third lecture, labour is thereby interpreted along the lines of an aesthetics of production and portrayed as a circular process of externalizing, objectifying, and appropriating essential forces. Accordingly, the process of the self-mediation of nature assumes into itself the self-realization of the acting subjects functioning within it. Both are processes of self-generation. They are produced out of their own products. Similarly, the society issuing from this praxis is conceived as a product of the forces and relationships of production created within it and by it. This figure of thought from praxis philosophy forces us to permit the moments of labour and nature, initially related distinctly to one another, to be absorbed into the totality of a self-referential process of reproduction. Ultimately, it is nature itself that reproduces itself through the reproduction of the subject writ large, society, and of the subjects active within it. Marx did not escape the totality thinking of Hegel. This changes if social praxis is no longer thought of primarily as a labour process. The complementary concepts of communicative action and life world introduce a difference that, unlike the difference between labour and nature, is not reabsorbed into a higher unity as its moments. To be sure, the reproduction of the life world is nourished by the contributions of communicative action, even as the latter is dependent in turn upon the resources of the life world. but we should not think of this circular process on the model of self-generation as a production out of its own products, and then associate it with self-realization. Otherwise, we would hypostatize the process of mutual understanding into an event of mediation, as happens to the labour process in praxis philosophy, and inflate the life world into the totality of a higher level subject, as happens to spirit in the philosophy of reflection. The difference between life world and communicative action is not taken back in any unity. It is even deepened to the extent that the reproduction of the life world is no longer merely routed through the medium of action oriented toward reaching understanding, but is saddled on the interpretative performances of its agents. To the degree that the yes or no decisions that sustain the communicative practice of everyday life do not derive from an ascribed normative consensus, but emerge from the cooperative interpretative processes of the participants themselves, concrete forms of life and universal structures of the life world become separated. Naturally, there are family resemblances among the plurality of totalities of life forms. They overlap and interlock, but they are not embraced in turn by some super-totality. Multiplicity and diffusion arise in the course of an abstraction process through which the contents of particular life worlds are set off ever more starkly from the universal structures of the life world. Considered as a resource, the life world is divided in accord with the given components of speech acts, that is, their propositional, illocutionary, and intentional components, into culture, society, and person. I call culture the store of knowledge from which those engaged in communicative action draw interpretations susceptible of consensus as they come to an understanding about something in the world. I call society, in the narrower sense of a component of the life world, the legitimate orders from which those engaged in communicative action gather a solidarity based on belonging to groups as they enter into interpersonal relationships with one another. Personality serves as a term of art for acquired competencies that render a subject capable of speech and action and hence able to participate in processes of mutual understanding in a given context, and to maintain his own identity in the shifting context of interaction. This conceptual strategy breaks with the traditional conception, also held by the philosophy of the subject and praxis philosophy, that societies are composed of collectivities and these in turn of individuals. Individuals and groups are members of a life world only in a metaphorical sense. The symbolic reproduction of the life world does take place as a circular process. The structural nuclei of the life world are made possible by their correlative processes of reproduction, and these in turn are made possible by contributions of communicative action. Cultural reproduction ensures that, in the semantic dimension, newly arising situations can be connected up with existing conditions in the world. It secures the continuity of tradition and a coherency of knowledge sufficient for the consensus needs of everyday practice. Social integration ensures that newly arising situations in the dimension of social space can be connected up with existing conditions in the world. It takes care of the coordination of action by means of legitimately regulated interpersonal relationships and lends constancy to the identity of groups. Finally, the socialization of members ensures that newly arising situations, in the dimension of historical time, can be connected up with existing world conditions. It secures the acquisition of generalized capacities for action for future generations and takes care of harmonizing individual life histories and collective life forms. Thus, interpretative schemata susceptible of consensus or valid knowledge, legitimately ordered interpersonal relationships or solidarities, and capacities for interaction or personal identities are renewed in these three processes of reproduction. If this is accepted as a theoretical description of a balanced and undistorted reproduction of the life world, we can pursue the following question, first of all by means of a thought experiment. In which direction would the structures of the life world have to vary if the undistorted reproduction of a concrete life form were to be less and less guaranteed by traditional, customary, time-tested, and consensual stocks of knowledge, and had to be secured instead by a risky searching for consensus, that is, by the cooperative achievements of those engaged in communicative action themselves? This is certainly an idealized projection, but not an utterly arbitrary one, since actual lines of development in modern life worlds stand out against the background of this thought experiment. The abstraction of universal life world structures from the particular configurations of totalities of forms of life that arise only as plural. On the cultural level, the traditional nuclei that guarantee identity separate off from the concrete contents with which they were once closely woven in mythical worldviews. They shrink to abstract elements such as concepts of the objective, social, and subjective worlds, presuppositions of communication, procedures of argumentation, abstract basic values, and so on. On the level of society, general principles are crystallized out of the particular context to which they were once bound in primitive societies. In modern societies, principles of legality and morality prevail which are less and less tailored to particular life forms. On the level of personality, the cognitive structures acquired in the process of socialization are dissociated ever more emphatically with the contents of cultural knowledge with which they were initially integrated in concrete thinking. The objects, with respect to which formal competencies can be exercised, become ever more variable. If we single out of these trends only the degree of freedom gained by the structural components of the life world, the following vanishing points result. For culture, a condition of the constant revision of traditions that have been unformed, that is, that have become reflective. For society, a condition of the dependence of legitimate orders upon formal and ultimately discursive procedures for establishing and grounding norms. For personality, a condition of the risk-filled self-direction of a highly abstract ego identity. There arise structural pressures toward the critical dissolution of guaranteed knowledge, the establishment of generalized values and norms, and self-directed individuation, since abstract ego identities point toward self-realization in autonomous life projects. This separation of form and content is a distant reminder of the traditional determination of a rational practice. Self-consciousness returns in the form of a culture become reflexive, self-determination in the form of generalized values and norms, self-realization in that of the advanced individuation of socialized subjects. But the growth in reflexivity and in universalism and in individuation undergone by the structural core of the life world in the course of its differentiation now no longer fits the description of an intensification within the dimensions of the subject's relation to self, and only under this description, that is, from the perspective of the philosophy of the subject, could societal rationalization, the unfolding of the rational potential of social practice, be represented as the self-reflection of a societal macro-subject. The theory of communication can do without this figure of thought. Now, the increasing reflexivity of culture, the generalization of values and norms, and the heightened individuation of socialized subjects, the enhancement of critical consciousness, autonomous will formation, and individuation, that is the strengthening of the moments of rationality once attributed to the practice of subjects, takes place under conditions of an ever more extensive and ever more finely woven net of linguistically generated intersubjectivity. Rationalization of the life world means differentiation and condensation at once, a thickening of the floating web of intersubjective threads that simultaneously holds together the ever more sharply differentiated components of culture, society, and person. The reproductive mode of the life world does not change linearly in the direction indicated by the catchwords reflexivity, abstract universalism, and individuation. Rather, the rationalized life world secures the continuity of its context of meaning with the discontinuous tools of critique. It preserves the context of social integration by the risky means of an individualistically isolating universalism, and it sublimates the overwhelming power of the genealogical nexus into a fragile and vulnerable universality by means of an extremely individualized socialization. The more abstractly the differentiated structures of the life world operate in the ever more particularized forms of life, the more the rational potential of action oriented toward reaching understanding evolves solely by these means. This can be clarified by the following thought experiment. Continuities in the semantic field would not have to be severed even if cultural reproduction could now occur only by way of critique. In a structurally differentiated life world, the development of the potential for negation inherent in the process of reaching agreement in language becomes a necessary condition for text to connect up with one another and for traditions, which live, of course, from the power of conviction, to continue. Nor would the intersubjective net knit together in social space out of relations of reciprocal recognition have to be torn apart if social integration could now occur only by way of a universalism that was abstract and at the same time individualistically tailored. The procedures of discursive will formation established in the structurally differentiated life world are set up to secure the social bond of all with all precisely through equal consideration of the interests of each individual. This means that as a participant in discourses, the individual, with his irreplaceable yes or no, is only fully on his own under the presupposition that he remains bound to a universal community by way of a cooperative quest for truth. Not even the substance of the universal within the historical succession of generations would have to dissolve away into nothing if processes of socialization could now advance only across the threshold of extreme individuation. In the structurally differentiated life world, we merely acknowledge a principle that was in operation from the beginning, to wit, that socialization takes place in the same proportion as individuation, just as, inversely, individuals are constituted socially. With the system of personal pronouns, a relentless pressure toward individuation is built into the use of language oriented toward mutual understanding that is proper to socializing interaction. At the same time, the force of an intersubjectivity pressing towards socialization comes to the fore through the same linguistic medium. Figures of thought from the theory of intersubjectivity thus render intelligible why critical testing and a fallibilist consciousness even enhance the continuity of a tradition that has stripped away its quasi-natural state of being. They make comprehensible why abstract, universalistic procedures for discursive will formation even strengthen solidarity in life contexts that are no longer legitimated by tradition. They help us to understand why an expanded scope for individuation and self-realization even condenses and stabilizes a process of socialization detached from fixed models of socialization. If one retrieves the normative content of modernity in this manner, a content that gets away from the concepts of praxis philosophy, if not from its intentions, the free moments once assembled into the dialectic of enlightenment now fall apart. As a principle of modernity, subjectivity was supposed to determine its normative content as well. At the same time, subject-centered reason led to abstractions that fragmented the ethical totality, and yet, only self-reflection, which emanated from subjectivity and strove to get beyond its narrow-mindedness, supposedly proved itself equal to the task of reconciliation. In its own way, praxis philosophy made this program its own. For Marx, the analysis of class antagonisms, their revolutionary overthrow, and the unleashing of the emancipatory content of stored-up forces of production were three conceptually interconnected moments. In this respect, the notion of reason derived from the structures of linguistically generated intersubjectivity and concretized in forms of rationalization processes in the life world provides no equivalent for the concept of an intrinsically rational praxis that was deployed in the philosophy of history. As soon as we give up praxis philosophy's understanding of society as a self-referential subject writ large, encompassing all individual subjects, the corresponding models for the diagnosis and mastery of crisis, division and revolution, are no longer applicable. Because the successive releasing of the rational potential inherent in communicative action is no longer thought of as self-reflection writ large, this specification of the normative content of modernity can prejudge neither the conceptual tools for diagnosing crises nor the way of overcoming them. The probability of conflict-free reproduction by no means increases with the degree of rationalization of the life world. It is only that the level at which conflicts can arise is shifted. With the differentiation of the structures of the life world, the forms in which social pathologies appear are multiplied according to which aspects of which structural factors are insufficiently taken care of. Loss of meaning, conditions of anomie, and psychopathologies are the most obvious kinds of symptoms, but not the only ones. As a result, the causes of social pathologies, which in the model of a division within a macro-subject are still clustered around class antagonism, now break up into widely scattered historical contingencies. The pathological characteristics of modern societies now fit into patterns only to the extent that a predominance of economic and bureaucratic rationality, of cognitive instrumental forms of rationality generally, make itself felt. The jagged profile of rationality potentials that have been unevenly exploited excludes from our explanatory approach the idea of a stagnated circular process of self-mediation in a divided macro-subject. It is obvious that, with these considerations, we have not yet touched at all on the question from which praxis philosophy started. As long as we leave the material reproduction of the life world out of consideration, as we have until now, we will not even reach the level of the older problematic. Indeed, Marx selected labour as his basic category because he could see how the structures of bourgeois society were ever more strongly stamped by abstract labour. That is, by the type of gainful labour steered by the market, valorised in a capitalist fashion, and organised into businesses. In the meantime, this tendency has clearly slackened. But the type of social pathology analysed by Marx, in terms of the real abstractions characteristic of alienated labour, has not thereby disappeared. Section 3. The approach of communication theory seems to be able to salvage the normative content of modernity, only at the cost of idealist abstractions. Once again, suspicion is cast on the purism of a purely communicative reason, this time on an abstract description of rationalized life worlds that does not take into account the constraints of material reproduction. In order to diffuse this suspicion, we have to show that the theory of communication can contribute to explaining how it is that in the modern period an economy organized in the form of markets is functionally intermeshed with a state that has a monopoly on power, how it gains autonomy as a piece of norm-free sociality over against the life world, and how it opposes its own imperatives based on system maintenance to the rational imperatives of the life world. Marx was the first to analyse this conflict between system imperatives and life world imperatives, in the form of a dialectic of dead labour and living labour, of abstract labour and concrete labour, and he vividly illustrated it with materials from social history concerning the eruption of new modes of production into traditional life worlds. Meanwhile, the kind of system rationality that first became evident in the independent logic of capital self-realization has taken over other domains of action as well. No matter how structurally differentiated life worlds may be, no matter whether they have developed highly specialized subsystems and subparts of subsystems, for the functional domains of cultural reproduction, social integration, and socialization, the complexity of any life world is narrowly restricted by the limits of the strain that can be placed upon the mechanism of mutual understanding. In the degree that a life world is rationalized, the expenditure of understanding borne by the communicative agents themselves increases. This also increases the risk of dissent in a communication that generates a bonding effect only via the double negation of validity claims. Ordinary language is a risky mechanism for coordinating action. It is also expensive, immobile, and restricted in what it can accomplish. The meaning of the individual speech act cannot be detached from the life world's complex horizon of meaning. It remains entwined with the intuitively present background knowledge of interaction participants. The plenitude of connotations, the functional richness, and the capacity for variation proper to the use of language or oriented toward mutual understanding is only the reverse side of a relationship to totality that does not allow for any arbitrary expansion of the capacity to achieve understanding in everyday praxis. Because life worlds can afford only a restricted outlay for coordination and understanding at a certain level of complexity, ordinary language has to be disencumbered by the sorts of special languages that Talcott Parsons studied in connection with the example of money. When the medium for coordinating action no longer has to be called upon for all linguistic functions at once, then there is a disburdening effect. The binding of communicatively guided action to contexts of the life world is also reduced by the partial replacement of ordinary language. Social processes, set free in this way, become de-worlded, that is, released from those relationships to the totality and those structures of intersubjectivity by which culture, society, and personality are interlaced with one another. Functions of material reproduction are especially open to this kind of disburdening because they do not per se need to be fulfilled by communicative actions. Changes in conditions in the material substrate can be traced back directly to the aggregate results and consequences of goal-directed interventions in the objective world. To be sure, these teleological actions need coordination too. They have to be socially integrated. But the integration can occur by way of an impoverished and standardized language that coordinates functionally specialized activities. For instance, the production and distribution of goods and services, without burdening social integration with the expense of risky and uneconomical processes of mutual understanding, and without connecting up with processes of cultural transmission and socialization through the medium of ordinary language. Evidently, the medium of money satisfies these conditions for a specially encoded steering language. It has branched off from normal language as a special code that is tailored to special situations of exchange. It conditions decisions for action on the basis of a built-in preference structure of supply and demand in a way that is effective for coordination, but without having to lay claim to the resources of life world. However, money makes possible not only specifically de-worlded forms of interaction, but the formation of a functionally specialized subsystem that articulates its relationships to environment via money. Considered historically, capitalism saw the rise of an economic system that regulates internal exchanges as well as interchanges with its non-economic environments, private households and the state, through monetary channels. The institutionalization of wage labour on the one hand, and that of a state based on taxation on the other, was as constitutive of the new mode of production as was the organisational form of the capitalist enterprise inside the economic system. Complementary environments were formed in the measure that the productive process was shifted over to wage labour and the apparatus of government was linked to production via taxes on those employed. On the one side, the state apparatus became dependent upon a media-steered economic system. This led, among other things, to the assimilation of official and personal power to the structure of a steering medium, that is, power became assimilated to money. On the other side, traditional forms of labour and of life broke down under the grip of gainful labour organised in business enterprises. The plebeianising of the rural population and the proletarianising of the labour force, highly concentrated in cities, became the first exemplary case of a systematically induced reification of everyday practice. With exchange processes operating through media, there emerges in modern societies a third level of autonomous functional contexts, above the level of simple interactions, as well as beyond the level of forms of organisation still bound to the life world. Contexts of interaction that have gained autonomy as subsystems and that go beyond the horizon of the life world congeal into the second nature of a norm-free sociality. This decoupling of system from life world is experienced within modern life worlds as a reification of life forms. Hegel reacted to this basic experience with the concept of the positive and the idea of a directed ethical totality. Marx started, more specifically, from alienated industrial labour and class antagonisms. Operating under premises of the philosophy of the subject, they both, nevertheless, underestimated the independent logic of systemically integrated domains of action that are dissociated from structures of intersubjectivity to such an extent that they no longer exhibit any structural analogies with socially integrated domains of action differentiated within the life world. For Hegel and Marx, the system of needs of capitalist society arose from processes of abstraction that still pointed to ethical totality or rational praxis and remained subject to their structures. These abstractions constituted non-independent moments within the self-relation and self-movement of a higher-level subject, into which they would flow once again. In Marx, this overcoming, Aufhebung, takes the shape of a revolutionary praxis, which breaks the systemic logic of capital's self-realization, brings the independent economic process back into the horizon of the life world again, and frees the realm of freedom from the dictates of the realm of necessity. In attacking the private ownership of the means of production, the revolution simultaneously strikes at the institutional foundations of the medium through which the capitalist economy was differentiated out. The life world, rigidified under the law of value, is to be given back its spontaneity. At the very moment, the objective illusion of capital will dissolve away into nothing. As we have seen, this melting down of systemically reified domains of action into a spontaneous relation to self, of spirit, or of society already met with strong opposition from the right Hegelians of the first generation. Against a de-differentiation of state and society, they insisted on the objective distinction between the societal system and the governmental subject. Their neoconservative successors gave this thesis an affirmative twist. Hans Freyer and Joachim Ritter saw in the dynamic of the reification of culture and society only the reverse side of the constitution of a realm of subjective freedom worth striving for. Arnold Galen criticized even the latter as an empty subjectivity released from all objective imperatives. Even those who, following Lukács, fastened upon the concept of reification, came to agree more and more with their opponents in their description. They were increasingly impressed with the impotence of subjects in relation to the feedback processes of self-regulating systems, over which they could have no influence. It makes almost no difference whether the one indicts as a negative totality what the other celebrates as a crystallization, or whether the one denounces as reification what the other technocratically lays down as a law of reality. For decades, this trend in the social theoretical diagnosis of the age has been heading toward the point that systems functionalism makes it into its own point. It allows the subjects themselves to degenerate into systems. It tacitly sets a seal on the end of the individual, which Adorno encircled with his negative dialectic and protested against as a self-inflicted fate. Nicholas Luhmann simply presupposes that the structures of intersubjectivity have collapsed, and that individuals have become disengaged from their life worlds, that personal and social systems form environments for each other. The barbaric condition predicted by Marx, in case revolutionary praxis failed, is characterized by a complete subsumption of the life world under the imperatives of a valorization process decoupled from use values and concrete labor. Undisturbed by this, systems functionalism proceeds from the assumption that this condition has already set in, not merely at the entrance to the capitalist economy, but in the forecourts of every functional system. The marginalized life world could survive only if it were to be transformed in turn into a media-steered subsystem, and if it were to shed everyday communicative practice like a snakeskin. On the one hand, Luhmann's version of systems functionalism takes up the heritage of the philosophy of the subject. It replaces the self-relating subject with a self-relating system. On the one hand, it radicalizes Nietzsche's critique of reason by withdrawing any kind of claim to reason, along with the relationship to the totality of the life world. The fact that Luhmann draws upon the reflective content of these two opposed traditions and brings motifs from Kant and Nietzsche together in a cybernetic language game indicates the level at which he establishes social systems theory. Luhmann takes the same characteristics that Foucault attributed to discourse formations with the help of a transcendental historical concept of power and transfers them to meaning-elaborating systems that operate in a self-relating fashion. Since he also relinquishes the intention of a critique of reason together with the concept of reason, he can turn all the statements that Foucault made by way of denunciation into descriptive ones. In this respect, Luhmann pushes the neoconservative affirmation of social modernity to a peak, and also to heights of reflection where everything the advocates of postmodernity could come up with has already been thought of, without any complaints and in a more differentiated matter. Moreover, systems functionalism is not open to the objection of being unable to give an account of its own status. It places itself without any hesitation within the system of science and comes forward with a claim to disciplinary universality. Nor can it be charged with a tendency toward levelling. At most, Luhmann's theory, which is today incomparable when it comes to its power of conceptualization, its theoretical imaginativeness, and its capacity for processing information, raises doubts as to whether the price for its gains in abstraction is not too high. The tireless shredding machine of reconceptualization separates out the undercomplex life world as an indigestible residue, precisely the realm of phenomena of interest to a social theory that has not burned all bridges to the pre-scientific experience of crisis. In regard to the capitalist economy, Marx did not distinguish between the new level of system differentiation brought about by a media-steered economic system and the class-specific forms of institutionalization. For him, abolishing class structures and melting down the independent systematic logic of functionally differentiated and reified domains of interaction formed a single syndrome. Luhmann commits a complementary error. Faced with the new level of differentiation of systems, he overlooks the fact that media, such as money and power, via which functional systems set themselves off from the life world, have in turn to be institutionalized in the life world. This is why the class-specific distributive effects of the media being anchored in property laws and constitutional norms do not come into view at all. Inclusion, in the sense of the equal rights of all individuals to access all functional systems, thus appears as a systemically necessary outcome of the process of differentiation. Whereas, for Marx, systematically autonomous, functional contexts go up in smoke after a successful revolution. For Luhmann, the life world now has already lost all significance in the functionally differentiated societies of the modern world. What disappears from both perspectives is a mutual interpretation and opposition of system and life world imperatives, which explains the double front character of societal modernization. The paradoxes of societal rationalization, which I have developed elsewhere, may be summarized in an oversimplified way as follows. The rationalization of the life world had to reach a certain maturity before the media of money and power could be legally institutionalized in it. The two functional systems of the market economy and the administrative state, which grew beyond the horizon of the political orders of stratified class societies, destroyed the traditional life forms of old European society to begin with. The internal dynamic of these two functionally intermeshed subsystems, however, also reacts back upon the rationalized life forms of modern society that made them possible, to the extent that processes of monetarization and bureaucratization penetrate the core domains of cultural reproduction, social integration, and socialization. Forms of interaction shaped by these media cannot encroach upon realms of life that by their function are dependent on action oriented to mutual understanding without the appearance of pathological side effects. In the political systems of advanced capitalist societies, we find compromise structures that, historically considered, can be conceived of as reactions on the part of the life world to the independent systemic logic and growth in complexity proper to the capitalist economic process, and a state apparatus with a monopoly on force. These origins have left their traces on the options that remain open to us in a social welfare state in crisis. The options are determined by the logic of a politics adjusted to the system imperatives of economy and state. The two media-steered subsystems, which constitute environments for one another, are supposed to be intelligently attuned to one another, and not simply to reciprocally externalize their costs so as to burden a total system incapable of self-reflection. Within the scope of such a politics, only the correctly dosed distribution of problems as between the subsystems of state and economy is in dispute. One side sees the causes of crisis in the unleashing of the dynamics proper to the economy, the other side in the bureaucratic fetters imposed on the former. The corresponding therapies are a social subduing of capitalism or a displacement of problems from administrative planning back to the market. The one side sees the source of the systemically induced disturbances of everyday life in monetarizing labor power, the other in the bureaucratic crippling of personal initiative. But both sides agree in assigning a merely passive role to the vulnerable domains of life-world interaction as against the motors of societal modernization, state, and economy. Meanwhile, the legitimists of the social welfare state are everywhere in retreat, while the neoconservatives complacently undertake to terminate the social welfare state compromise, or at least to redefine its conditions in return for an energetic improvement of the valorization conditions of capital. Neoconservatives accept in the bargain costs that can be shifted in the short term to the life world of the underprivileged and marginalized, but also risks that rebound upon society as a whole. There arise the new class structures of a society segmented on its ever-widening margins. Economic growth is kept going by innovations that, for the first time, are intentionally tied to an armament spiral that has gone out of control. At the same time, the intrinsic normative logic of rationalized life worlds now finds expression, however selectively, not only in the classical demands for more distributive justice, but in the wide spectrum of so-called post-material values in the interest in conserving the natural basis of human life and in preserving the internal communicative structures of highly differentiated life forms. So it is that system imperatives and life-world imperatives form new frictional surfaces that spark new conflicts which cannot be dealt with in the existing compromise structures. The question posed today is whether a new compromise can be arranged in accord with the old rules of system-oriented politics, or whether the crisis management attuned to crises that are systematically caused and perceived as systemic will be undermined by social movements no longer oriented to system steering needs, but to the processes at the boundaries between system and life-world. Section 4. With this question, we touch upon the other moment, the possibility of mastering crises in grand format, for which praxis philosophy once offered the means of revolutionary praxis. If society as a whole is no longer thought of as a higher-level subject that knows itself, determines itself, and realizes itself, there are no paths of relation to self upon which the revolutionaries could enter in order to work with, for, and on the crippled macro-subject. Without a self-relating macro-subject, anything like a self-reflective knowledge on the part of the social totality is just as inconceivable as society's having an influence upon itself. As soon as the higher-level intersubjectivity of public processes of opinion and consensus formation takes the place of the higher-level subject of society as a whole, relations to self of this kind lose their meaning. It is questionable whether under these changed premises it still makes any sense to speak of a society exercising influence upon itself at all. For a society to influence itself in this sense, it must have, on the one hand, a reflexive centre, where it builds up a knowledge of itself in a process of self-understanding, and, on the other hand, an executive system that, as a part, can act for the whole and influence the whole. Can modern societies meet these conditions? Systems theory projects a picture of them as acentric societies without central organs. On this account, the life world has disintegrated without remainder into the functionally specialized subsystems such as economy, state, education, center, and so on. These systemic monads, which have replaced withered intersubjective relationships with functional connections, are symmetrically related to one another, but their precarious equilibrium is not susceptible of being regulated for society as a whole. They must reciprocally balance one another, since none of the total societal function that comes to the fore with them attains a primacy for society as a whole. None of the subsystems could occupy the top of a hierarchy and represent the whole the way the emperor could once do for the empire in stratified societies. Modern societies no longer have at their disposal an authoritative centre for self-reflection and steering. From the viewpoint of systems theory, only the subsystems develop anything like a self-consciousness, and they do so only in view of their own function. The whole is reflected in the partial system's self-consciousness only from the perspective of that system as its respective social environment. Hence, a consensus functional for society as a whole about what is and what is valid is difficult, in fact impossible. What is used as a consensus functions in the form of a recognized provisional arrangement. In addition to this, there are the really productive syntheses of reality that are functionally specific at the levels of complexity that individual functional systems can achieve for themselves, but can no longer add up to a comprehensive worldview in the sense of a congregatio corporum or a universitas rerum. Luhmann elaborates on this provisional arrangement in a footnote as follows. It was a peculiar decision of Husserlian philosophy, with considerable ramifications for sociological discussions, to endow this provisional arrangement with the status of an ultimately valid basis of a concrete a priori by giving it the title of life world. It is sociologically untenable to postulate for the life world any kind of primacy in being. The legacy of Husserlian a priorism may mean a burden for various versions of social phenomenology, but the communications theoretic concept of the life world has been freed from the mortgages of transcendental philosophy. If one is to take the basic fact of linguistic socialization into account, one will be hard put to do without this notion. Participants in interaction cannot carry out speech acts that are effective for coordination unless they impute to everyone involved an intersubjectively shared life world that is angled toward the situation of discourse and anchored in bodily centres. For those acting in the first person singular or plural with an orientation toward mutual understanding, each life world constitutes a totality of meaning relations and referential connections with a 0 point in the coordinate system shaped by historical time, social space, and semantic field. Moreover, the different life worlds that collide with one another do not stand next to each other without any mutual understanding as totalities. They follow the pull of their claims to universality and work out their differences until their horizons of understanding fuse with one another, as Gadamer puts it. Consequently, even modern, largely decentered societies maintain in their everyday communicative action a virtual centre of self-understanding, from which even functionally specified systems of action remain within intuitive reach, as long as they do not outgrow the horizon of the life world. This centre is, of course, a projection, but it is an effective one. The polycentric projections of the totality, which anticipate, outdo, and incorporate one another, generate competing centres. Even collective identities dance back and forth in the flux of interpretations, and are actually more suited to the image of a fragile network than to that of a stable centre of self-reflection. Nevertheless, everyday practice affords a locus for spontaneous processes of self-understanding and identity formation, even in non-stratified societies that no longer have a knowledge of themselves available in the traditional forms of representative self-presentation. Even in modern societies, a diffuse common consciousness takes shape in the polyphonous and obscure projections of the totality. This common consciousness can be concentrated and more clearly articulated around specific themes and ordered contributions. It achieves greater clarity in the higher level, concentrated communicative processes of a public sphere. Technologies of communication, such as book publishing and the press first of all, and then radio and television, make utterances available for practically any context, and make possible a highly differentiated network of public spheres, local and trans-regional, literary, scientific and political, within parties or associations, media-dependent or subcultural. Within these public spheres, processes of opinion and consensus formation, which depend upon diffusion and mutual interpenetration, no matter how specialized they are, get institutionalized. The boundaries are porous. Each public sphere is open to other public spheres. To their discursive structures they owe a universalist tendency that is hardly concealed. All partial public spheres point to a comprehensive public sphere in which society as a whole fashions a knowledge of itself. The European Enlightenment elaborated this experience and took it up to its programmatic formulas. What Luhmann calls the consensus functioning for the whole of society is context-dependent and fallible, provisional in fact, but this reflexive knowledge on the part of the society as a whole exists. Only now it is due to the higher level intersubjectivity of public spheres, and hence can no longer satisfy the sharp criteria of self-reflection by a higher level subject. Of course, such a centre of self-understanding is insufficient for a society to exercise influences over itself. For this, it would also require a central steering authority that could receive and translate into action the knowledge and the impulses from the public sphere. According to the normative ideas of our political tradition, the democratically legitimated apparatus of state, having been shifted from the sovereignty of princes to the sovereignty of the people, is supposed to be able to put into effect the opinion and will of the citizenry as a public. The citizens themselves participate in the formation of collective consciousness, but they cannot act collectively. Can the government do so? Collective action would mean that the government would transpose the intersubjectively constituted self-knowledge of society organisationally into the self-determination of society. And yet, even on systems theoretic grounds, one has to doubt this possibility. As a matter of fact, today politics has become an affair of a functionally specialised subsystem, and the latter does not dispose over the measure of autonomy relative to the other systems that would be required for central steering. That is, for an influence of society as a totality upon itself, an influence that comes from it and goes back to it. In modern societies, there obviously exists an asymmetry between the weak capacities for intersubjective self-understanding and the missing capacities for the self-organisation of society as a whole. Under these changed premises, there is no equivalent for the philosophy of the subject's model of self-influence in general, and for the Hegelian Marxist understanding of revolutionary action in particular. This insight has come into broad effect, carried along by a specific experience that labour parties and unions have had, above all in their attempts to realise the social welfare state project since the end of the Second World War. I'm talking neither about the economic problems that cropped up as a result of successful social welfare legislation during the period of Reconstruction, nor about the limits of power and the ability of planning administrations to intervene, nor about the problems of steering at all. I mean, rather, a characteristic transformation in the perception of the democratically legitimated state power that had to be brought to bear in pursuing the goal of socially taming the nature-like capitalist economic system, and especially the goal of neutralizing the destructive side effects of its crisis-filled expansion on the existence and life world of dependent workers. Advocates of the social welfare state regarded it as unproblematic that an active government should intervene not only in the economic cycle, but also in the life cycle of its citizens. The goal indeed was to reform the living conditions of the citizens by way of reforming the conditions of labour and employment. Underlying this was the democratic tradition's idea that society could exercise an influence over itself by the neutral means of political administrative power. Just this expectation is what has been disappointed. In the meantime, an increasingly dense network of legal norms of governmental and paragovernmental bureaucracies has been drawn over the everyday life of its actual and potential clients. Extensive discussions about legal regulation and bureaucratization, in general, about the counterproductive effects of government welfare policies in particular, about the professionalization and scientization of social services, have drawn attention to circumstances that make one thing clear. The legal, administrative means of translating social welfare programs into action are not some passive, as it were, propertyless medium. They are connected, rather, with a praxis that involves isolation of facts, normalization, and surveillance, the reifying and subjectivating violence of which Foucault has traced right down into the most delicate capillary tributaries of everyday communication. The deformations of a life world that is regulated, fragmented, monitored, and looked after are surely more subtle than the palpable forms of material exploitation and impoverishment, but internalized social conflicts that have shifted from the corporeal to the psychic are not therefore less destructive. Today, one sees a contradiction inherent in the social welfare project as such. Its substantive goal was to set free life forms structured in an egalitarian way, which was supposed at the same time to open up space for individual self-realization and spontaneity. But too great a demand was placed upon the medium of power in expecting it to call forth new forms of life. Once the state has been differentiated out as one among many media-steered functional systems, it should no longer be regarded as a central steering authority in which society brings together its capabilities for organizing itself. A functional system that has grown beyond the horizon of the life world and become independent, that shuts itself off from the perspectives of society as a whole, and that can perceive society as a whole only from the perspective of a subsystem, stands over against processes of opinion and will formation in a general public sphere, which, however diffuse, are still directed to society as a whole. A new, as it were, stereoscopically sharpened view of the political emerges from the historical disillusionment with a bureaucratically coagulated social welfare state project. In addition to the independent systemic logic of a power medium that only seems to be usable in a purposive rational manner, another dimension becomes visible, the public sphere as political, in which complex societies can acquire normative distance from themselves and work out experiences of crisis collectively, takes on a remoteness from the political system similar to the remoteness it previously had from the economic system. The political system has acquired a similarly problematic character, or at least one with two battlefronts. Now it is itself perceived as a source of steering problems and not simply as a means for the solution of problems. Thus, we've become conscious of the difference between steering problems and problems of mutual understanding. We can see the difference between systemic disequilibria and life-world pathologies, between disturbances of material reproduction and deficiencies in the symbolic reproduction of the life-world. We come to recognize the distinction between the deficits that inflexible structures of the life world can cause in the maintenance of the systems of employment and domination, via the withdrawal of motivation or legitimation on the one hand, and the manifestations of a colonization of the life world by the imperatives of functional systems that externalize their costs on the other. Such phenomena demonstrate once more that the achievements of steering and those of mutual understanding are resources that cannot be freely substituted for one another. Money and power can neither buy nor compel solidarity and meaning. In brief, the result of the process of disillusionment is a new state of consciousness, in which the social welfare state project becomes reflexive to a certain extent and aims at taming not just the capitalist economy, but the state itself. However, if not only capitalism, but also the interventionist state itself is to be socially tamed, the task has to be defined anew. The welfare state project entrusted the planning capacity of public administrations with having a stimulating influence upon the self-steering mechanism of a different subsystem. If this regulation, applied so very indirectly, is now supposed to extend to the organizational performances of the state, the mode of influence may not be specified again as indirect steering, for a new steering potential could only be furnished by another subsystem. Even if we could come up with a supplementary system of this sort, after a further round of disappointment and distantiation, we would again face a problem that perceptions of crises in the life world cannot be translated without remainder into systems-related problems of steering. Instead, it is a question of building up restraining barriers for the exchanges between system and life world, and of building in sensors for the exchanges between life world and system. At any rate, limit problems of this sort are posed as soon as a highly rationalized life world is to be shielded against the intolerable imperatives of the occupational system or against the penetrating side effects of the administrative provision for life. The systemic spell cast by the capitalist labour market over the life histories of those able to work, by the network of responsible, regulating, and supervising public authorities over the life forms of their clients, and by the now autonomous nuclear arms race over the life expectancy of peoples, cannot be broken by systems learning to function better. Rather, impulses from the life world must be able to enter into the self-steering of functional systems. Of course, this would require altering the relationship between autonomous, self-organized public spheres on the one hand, and realms of action steered by money and power on the other, or in other words, a new division of powers within the dimension of social integration. The socially integrating power of solidarity would have to be in a position to assert itself against the systemically integrating steering media of money and power. I call those public spheres autonomous, which are neither bred nor kept by a political system for purposes of creating legitimation. Centers of concentrated communication that arise spontaneously out of microdomains of everyday practice can develop into autonomous public spheres and consolidate as self-supporting, higher-level intersubjectivities only to the degree that the life-world potential for self-organization and for the self-organized use of the means of communication are utilized. Forms of self-organization strengthen the collective capacity for action. Grassroots organizations, however, may not cross the threshold to the formal organization of independent systems. Otherwise, they will pay for the indisputable gain in complexity by having organizational goals detached from the orientations and attitudes of their members and dependent instead upon imperatives of maintaining and expanding organizational power. The lack of symmetry between capacities for self-reflection and for self-organization that we have ascribed to modern societies as a whole is repeated on the level of the self-organization of processes of opinion and will formation. This need not be an obstacle if one considers that the indirect influence of functionally differentiated subsystems on the individual mechanisms of self-steering means something altogether different from the goal-oriented influence of society upon itself. Their self-referential closedness renders the functional systems of politics and economics immune against attempts at intervention in the sense of direct interventions. Yet, this same characteristic also renders systems sensitive to stimuli aimed at increasing their capacity for self-reflection, that is, their sensitivity to the reactions of the environment to their own activities. Self-organized public spheres must develop the prudent combination of power and intelligent self-restraint that is needed to sensitize the self-steering mechanisms of the state and the economy to the goal-oriented outcomes of radical democratic will formation. In place of the model of society influencing itself, we have the model of boundary conflicts, which are held in check by the life world, between the life world, and two subsystems that are superior to it in complexity and can be influenced by it only indirectly, but on whose performances it at the same time depends. Autonomous public spheres can draw their strength only from the resources of largely rationalized life worlds. This holds true especially for culture, that is to say, for sciences and philosophy's potential for interpretations of self and world, for the enlightenment potential of strictly universalistic, legal and moral representations, and not last, for the radical experiential contents of aesthetic modernity. It is no accident that social movements today take on cultural revolutionary traits. Nonetheless, a structural weakness can be noticed here that is indigenous to all modern life worlds. Social movements get their thrust power from threats to well-defined collective identities, although such identities always remain tied to the particularism of a special form of life. They have to assimilate the normative content of modernity, the fallibilism, universalism, and subjectivism that undermine the force and concrete shape of any given particularity. Until now, the democratic and constitutional nation-state that emerged from the French Revolution was the only identity formation successful on a world historical scale that could unite these two moments of the universal and the particular without coercion. The Communist Party has been unable to replace the identity of the nation-state. If not in the nation, in what other soil can universalistic value orientations today take root? The Atlantic community of values crystallized around NATO is hardly more than a propaganda formula for ministers of defense. The Europe of de Gaulle and Adenauer merely furnishes the superstructure for the basis of trade relations. Quite recently, left intellectuals have been projecting a completely different design as a counter-image to the Europe of the common market. The dream of such a completely different European identity, which assimilates in a decisive way the legacy of Occidental rationalism, is taking shape at a time when the United States is getting ready to fall back into illusions of the early modern period under the banner of a Second American Revolution. In the utopias painted in the old romances about the state, rational forms of life entered into a deceptive symbiosis with the technological mastery of nature and the ruthless mobilization of social labor power. This equation of happiness and emancipation with power and production has been a source of irritation for the self-understanding of modernity from the start, and it has called forth 2 centuries of criticism of modernity. But the same utopian, in the bad sense, gestures of mastery are living on now in a caricature that moves the masses. The science fiction of Star Wars is just good enough for the ideology planners to spark, with the macabre vision of a militarized space, an innovative thrust that would give the colossus of worldwide capitalism sufficient footing for its next round of technological development. Old Europe could only find its way clear to a new identity if it opposed to this short circuit of economic growth, arms race, and traditional values the vision of breaking out of these self-inflicted systemic constraints, if it put an end to the confused idea that the normative content of modernity that is stored in rationalized life worlds could be set free only by means of ever more complex systems. The idea that the capacity to compete on an international scale, whether in markets or in outer space, is indispensable for our very survival, is one of those everyday certitudes in which systemic constraints are condensed. Each one justifies the expansion and intensification of its own forces by the expansion and intensification of the forces of the others, as if it were not the ground rules of social Darwinism that are at the bottom of the play of forces. Modern Europe has created the spiritual presuppositions and the material foundations for a world in which this mentality has taken the place of reason. That is the real heart of the critique of reason, since Nietzsche. Who else but Europe could draw from its own traditions the insight, the energy, the courage of vision, everything that would be necessary to strip from the no longer metaphysical but metabiological premises of a blind compulsion to system maintenance and system expansion their power to shape our mentality? That was the end of Lecture 12 of The Philosophical Discourse of Modernity by Jürgen Habermas, sponsored by the John Domino's Institute. All John Domino's audiobooks are sometimes in the public domain at some time. For more information or to volunteer, go to www.dominospizza. Only if you're lactose intolerant.